Ahsoka, Balance of Truth, Book 2. Chapter 2. Barris couldn't help but feel a sudden surge of unease as her journey through time and space drew to a close. She settled into the shuttle's pilot's seat, having chosen the new class vessel over the proffered Theta. Despite her thorough preparation and the back to stasis, she was aware of the unpredictable elements in her path as her hand instinctively reached for her repaired jaw and cheek and the smoothness of the flesh under her touch, a stark reminder of her recent past. The proximity chime began to chirp throughout the small cabin, and Barris instinctively reached for the ship's yoke with both hands as the small vessel decanted from hyperspace. She felt her jaw drop as the colorful planet snapped into view across the entirety of the canopy before her. The unexpected greens and blues of the planet below starkly contrasted her expectations, sparking a sense of intrigue within. Snow-capped ridges, winding rivers, and lush greenery were a sight to behold. Barris was unsure if her surprise was due to the unexpected beauty or her reaction to it, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a very long time. The vibrant colors and thriving life on Ambria were a stark contrast to her expectations. Her unease grew into a wild sense of disquiet and burgeoning apprehension as she looked out the transparisteel. Still, the planet's beauty was so overwhelming that it was impossible to ignore. Stealing her mind through the dark side, Barris quickly supplanted fear and doubt with confidence and resolve. She punched in the landing coordinates furnished to her and sat back, allowing the landing cycle to guide the shuttle to her designated coordinates. Crossing her arms before her chest, Barris focused on maintaining her composure rather than any comfort the gesture could offer. The ship screamed through the atmosphere and slowed as its trajectory brought it closer to the darkening ground below, a glance to her left affirming that she was in for an interesting sunset. A gentle rumble of the decelerating thrusters gave way to viable repulsor suspension and maneuvering jets, droning the cabin into an eerie silence, broken only by various chimes and beeps emitting from the control panels. Barris got up from her seat and slowly approached the ramp as the ship reached its destination. The shuttle began slow before a small thump could be heard, and she felt as the landing struts found purchase on the ground below. The ship recoiled slowly and steadily as the inertial compensation feature balanced its bulk upon its slightly canted pads. Barris closed her eyes and breathed deeply as the ramp issued forth with a sharp hiss and short gusts of residual steam from the respective cooling units blasting the blazing hot maneuvering jets. She opened her eyes to a panoramic view, silent but for the cooling units performing their functions sporadically. A vast lake stretched out before her, rimmed with lush reeds at its shoreline, the distant sun settling between two mountain peaks many kilometers distant, its reflected light from the still black waters illuminating the backs and necks of fauna she couldn't identify. Bright blue and purple flowers dotted the grassland surrounding her, and an aggravated buzzing of various insects performing their meticulous duties in their final acts of daylight. A transcendent arc of color filled the cloudless sky as the sun's reach fought the encroaching darkness. Reds, oranges, and pinks giving way to calm blues and deep purples. Barris breathed in deeply through her nose, the air itself sweet with the mingling sense of aromatic life, bringing a sense of tranquility to the scene. An unexpected feeling of nostalgia washed over Barris, bringing an equally unexpected feeling of intrinsic peace. Her immediate thought took her by complete surprise, one of her own transcendence, one away from motive and objective, one of life and away from death. Her surprise was punctuated when a pair of the bipedal beasts at the lake's edge, some 30 meters distant, began slowly canting toward her at the ramp's edge. She wasn't sure what had prompted the action, as she had not moved a muscle after decanting the ship, but she also felt a particular appropriateness in their approach. The closer they came, the easier Barris could recognize several features. Strong, powerful legs housed protruding massive tendons and muscles as they contracted and relaxed with every step forward. Long, sleek snouts and pointed ears fell behind their slim skulls, and short, clawed forelimbs were nibbling away at the air before them, keeping forward balance in step with a massive sweeping tail. Thick, shaggy, dark-rooted fur blanketed their entire frames, the color lightening to a dirty blonde at the fibers' tips. They made no sound as they padded toward her, but Barris knew she shouldn't allow the scene, nor the animal's approach, to distract her from her goals. But not even she possessed the ability to ignore the intricacy of the Force's will. She felt the conundrum from within, an internal struggle between purpose and chaos, between intent or design and just simply being. The bipedal animals were within 3 meters when they slowed their approach, both nodding their heads low with each deliberate step. Barris had seen them before, and read reports not meant for her eyes that had attributed these beasts to select rebel victories. Crayson Thumper, she said to herself. What are you doing out here, I wonder? She spoke softly to the lead animal, its eyes warm and compassionate. It fluttered its eyes quickly before letting forth a profound and resounding growl from deep within. Barris quickly eyed the flexing claws it bore on its forelimbs and slowly moved her hands down toward her waist. The thumper watched intensely, twitching its ears around in a constant vigil before closing its eyes again and moving closer, bowing its head low before her chin. Barris relaxed her hands and let go of the lightsaber hilt she was teasing with her fingertips, slowly bringing her left hand up to stroke the short hairs on the beast's snout. It let forth a whimper at her touch as it pushed its face closer toward her contact, forcing Barris's hand to stroke it fully across its muzzle. She brought her right hand to scratch between its ears, causing the animal to swish its tail with satisfaction. Barris couldn't temper the notion that every sense in her possession told her she was making a mistake. Her memories of the Jedi condemning any attachment, her current master's teachings of the dark side, and those Sith adepts warning her not to care about any of it. Now, none of it mattered in the slightest, despite only just coming to rest upon Ambria's surface. She didn't care about what she shouldn't be or shouldn't do. Her only thoughts were of her surroundings and the peace presented through the trust the animal before her had given without judgment. She closed her eyes and thrust aside her objective as she inspected the thumper. A low cradle in the creature's spine denoting that it had either been a pack animal or been mounted in the past. The animal turned its head toward her as she moved around to its side, rubbing his ribcage. Barris stretched out on her toes to reach his spine, running her fingertips over its vertebrae, its right leg twitching with obvious appreciation. She continued her inspection, approaching the massive tail, knowing indiscriminately what damage it could be capable of. Out of respect for the beast, she took the long way around, maintaining contact with her fingertips through the process, stopping momentarily under its snout for deep scratches. The thumper raised its head to the skies, allowing her to dig deep with both hands as she rubbed vigorously. Barris could feel the peace and the animal's pleasure at all the attention she continued down to his other side, looking for a marking or a branding. She found nothing through her inspections and couldn't help but wonder why they were here again. She glanced at the second of the two that had curled up around itself in the grasses close to her landing strut, directly under one of the maneuvering jets. Barris guessed it was clinging to whatever heat remained, letting her know something she didn't about her first night on Ambria. Barris let her hand drop from the lead thumper and headed slowly back up the ramp to the ship, returning seconds later with a pack slung over her shoulder and carrying a small duffel. The thumper hadn't moved from its spot, only tucked its legs under itself and waited for her, sitting in anticipation. Barris approached it with a smile, petting it softly before continuing her path toward the second animal, slapping her thigh lightly to invite her new companion to follow. Barris continued her approach as the second thumper raised its head in mild curiosity. She dropped her gear, then herself, a meter from its resting form before removing a small black bundle from the duffel. She placed it before her and sat back, wondering how the animals would react, but decided to follow through with their intentions no matter the outcome. Barris held out her hand to the bundle before her, igniting a small green flame in the center of her palm with a simple chant. Noting neither of the beasts disturbed at the sight. She thrust her palm forward, sending the green flame speeding toward the bundle. Then she watched as it swirled around the bundle and slowly ignited its edges, bringing a small fire to life within. The lead thumper canted closer to the small flame, falling back into a seated position beside Barris, the second thumper working itself closer to the warmth. Barris unslung her pack and began digging through it, looking for a ration pack. Her new companion elicited mild curiosity through a low grunt as she rummaged through its contents. Retrieving her hand victoriously, she tore open the metallic wrapper and ripped her teeth into the rubbery bar within. Chewing without conviction, she looked into the beast's eye. "You're going to need a name," she said quietly to the thumper, staring through his gaze and into the soul of the animal within. "Quinn," she said to him. "You look like a Quinn to me." He only whimpered slightly at the words, looking furtively at the bar in her hands. She glanced down, then back into his eyes. "Hungry, Quinn?" she asked him, patting his broadside a few times before tearing off a small chunk of the bar and tossing it at his muzzle. Quinn lowered his snout to sniff the ration a few times before daring himself to take it into his mouth. He chewed it a few times before swallowing it whole. "At least someone likes them," Barris said, snapping off another small section with her teeth and tossing the remainder to Quinn. As the last of the day's light leached from the land around her, Barris felt the chill of the encroaching night follow right behind. She rummaged through the pack again for a thermal blanket and tossed it over her legs. Taking a long, hard look at Quinn beside her, she slid her bottom closer to his extensive belly, resting her back against its warm fur. Matted strands clung to his heaving form in some places and lay sheen in others, dancing on the slight breeze that had ensued. Quinn turned his head, curled his neck to nuzzle her right side, and swung his hairy tail to her left to form a nest around her, depriving her of the gentle wind that had kept the animal's smell from her nostrils. She hadn't realized how pungent he was, but decided against complaining about it through action out of respect for his measures. She chuckled at the thought that would have been nonsensical, but an hour passed. Quinn didn't react at all, other than to close his eyes and swing his tail closer to his head. She looked over toward the second thumper, catching it looking at her with its head raised. Barris assumed the two were a mated pair, and this was a female. Her fur was much lighter and shorter, her spine a shock of white. She blinked her eyes twice, then laid her head back into the grass. Without warning, she blurted out a high-pitched cooing sound, shaking the shock from her spine. Quinn answered with a throaty grunt and moved his body similarly. Barris could see the female's head, her eyes unblinking, staring directly at her through the grass. She watched the animal intensely, trying to assign a word for her actions and demeanor, unable to remember the last time she had felt more at ease or relaxed. Eerie, she thought the perfect name to describe the thumper. "I guess that'll do. Eerie," she said, watching as Eerie turned her head toward the lake, shuffling her form closer to the dying embers of the quick fire Barris had erected. Barris knew the fire wouldn't last much longer, and realized Eerie would more than likely end up right against herself and Quinn as the night progressed. She fished around again in her pack one last time for another ration bar, tore the foil from it, and tossed it gently on the ground at Quinn's tail. Eerie got up, patted toward the bar, and sniffed at it deeply, just before snapping it up with her powerful jaw and swallowing it whole. The thumper bobbed her head and blinked at Barris, turning her head to the side and scrutinizing her as Barris had Quinn. She didn't move a muscle, just returned the thumper's gaze. Barris realized what the animal was doing, deciding on trust, and then she understood the enormity of the process. The thumper was imprinting. Barris couldn't dismiss the initial thoughts of how useless the practice would be. Imprinted or not, she had her agenda here, and that would come first. Eerie continued, ignoring Barris's mental protests. Her thoughts consistent, Barris only thought of the morning ahead of her and the trek toward the Tyrnval Mountains. A trek these beasts could prove useful for. She chuckled to herself again and tried to turn her gaze from the thumpers, finding she could not. A sudden but brief wave of panic took hold, not one born from the present situation, but a panic related to her past. A past filled with instances where she wasn't in control of herself, her mind, or even her actions. She pulled herself back into the present completely with a shake of her head and gave the thumper the acknowledgement it was searching for with a deep bow of her head to the ground, severing the eye contact. For reasons she couldn't comprehend, she immediately felt the animal. Barris could feel her love and fears, what agitated her, what she liked and didn't. She knew she was a she. She knew Erie was pregnant, and Quinn was her mate and the offspring's father. She also knew there was nothing she would not do for either of them. Dank Ferric. She said to herself that the knowledge of the ritual she wasn't even aware of taking place was beginning to settle into some form of normalcy. After blasting herself for being caught off guard, she began to accept her situation as something more significant than she could immediately see. The fire had gone out, and Erie had curled up with Quinn and herself, providing all the warmth and comfort they would need through the chill in the night air. Barris laid her head back fully into Quinn's side, staring up into the night sky, amazed at the view above her. Their side of Ambria was engulfed in complete darkness, the zero light allowing her to see the stars from an entirely different perspective. Ribbons of gaseous nebula spanning the color wheel, airglow from self-illuminating gases in the atmosphere, and occasional meteors firing themselves across the atmospheric layers of Ambria painted foreground to the thousands and thousands of glowing white stars in the background. Barris could not help but appreciate its beauty from the ground. She thought that space didn't look like this while she was in it, or maybe she just hadn't taken the time to look. Barris was overcome by the notion that she could name most of the stars she was looking at, identify their respective systems, and in most cases rattle off the corresponding Imperial installation in those systems. Her gaze was filled with countless perspectives different from her current position, and she wondered how far her empire would reach. Several words sailed her thoughts, as well as ways to describe the sights she had already seen on Ambria and the night sky above it. Beautiful, awe-inspiring, majestic. She couldn't stop the words from coming. Words she hadn't even thought, much less uttered in decades. Her words contrasted what she knew of the world she was looking up at, though how they were all valued by what they could provide the Imperial machine, not once for anything intrinsic. Dismissing the inner dialogue with a shake of her head, she took in one last panoramic sweep of the night sky before placing her hands behind her head and finally closing her eyes. The dreams assailed Barris within minutes. She was looking through the bacta fluid she was submerged in, trying to focus on the wavy specks of light she could see through the watery obfuscation. Control panels, she knew. Blinking green lights, static blue and white. There was movement outside the transparent tank, shadowy and elusive. She knew she wasn't alone in the room, but even her subconscious understood that normality. A face floated into her view, a head without a body. Large, unblinking eyes looked upon her from the other side of the tank, then looked down at a datapad that had materialized in long, slender fingers. Barris tried to focus on the form before her, struggling through the optical hurdles, her physical limits, and the web of various tubes attached to her body. The form lifted its head once again to investigate the Mirialan's eyes. The reality of what she was looking at finally struck her. Kaminoan, she said into the tube, feeding her life-giving air. Barris was unsure if the form heard or understood what she had said, as it only looked down once more, lifting a finger above the datapad and hesitantly pressing down. The dreams continued, visions of what she had anticipated Ambria to look like taking shape through her own research. The brackish waters of Lake Nath encrusting its shores with a soupy brown foam, the same Lake Nath whose shore she had come to land her shuttle upon. Barris was floating above scrub and cracked dry land through the perspective of one of her Empire's probe droids, speeding its way toward the mountains in the distance. text superimposed itself in the foreground, relaying distances, assumed weather data, and points she had distinguished as important while assembling her data recordings. The speeding perspective finally slowed upon reaching the foothills of the Tierenball Range, mapping coordinates in blinking yellow and establishing a route toward a canyon with no name. Her subconscious began to contradict the information fed through the dream, knowing full well the mountains were tree-laced and teeming with flora and fauna. The recording, however, continued its assault with views of blackened, scorched land, the cracked ground webbing in all directions, and finally the image of a giant reptile. The probe's perspective slowed to gather information on the life form, approaching the animal cautiously. Looking through the probe's perspective, Bear saw the enormous orange eyes focus, and its 6 legs canter the beast toward the probe. The canter became a slithering gallop as it bent its head forward just before it broke into a run the probe couldn't keep up with. The last thing Bear saw was the lizard's open jaw and razor-sharp teeth as it crushed the invading probe with a single snap of its powerful jaw.